The White House is one of the most documented places on Earth, and yet some of its most important decisions left no lasting record. Drafts were discarded, notes were never archived, conversations happened where no transcript was ever created. This is not a story about what was hidden. It is a story about what was never meant to remain. Power does not document itself evenly. Inside the White House, decisions are made at different speeds, under different conditions, and for different audiences. Some are slow, deliberate, and ceremonial. Others are immediate, improvised, and never intended to leave the room in which they occur. From the outside, history appears orderly, recorded through speeches, executive orders, and official memoranda. From the inside, it is fragmented. The idea that every meaningful decision is preserved in an archive is comforting. It suggests continuity, accountability, and memory. But the reality of governance operates on a different logic. Not everything that matters is written down. Not everything that is written down is meant to survive. From its earliest days, the White House has functioned as both an administrative center and a private workspace. It is an institution, but also a residence. A workplace, but also a refuge. This dual nature shapes how information is handled. Official records coexist with personal notes. Formal briefings sit beside handwritten reminders. Some materials are generated specifically to enter history. Others exist only to serve the moment. The distinction between the two is rarely visible from the outside. Within the executive branch, documentation follows rules. These rules define what constitutes a record, what must be preserved, and what can be discarded. They are shaped by law, precedent, and practicality. They are also shaped by intent. A record is not simply information. It is information that the system has decided to remember. Working papers, draft memoranda, personal notes, informal summaries, and verbal briefings occupy a different category. They are tools, not artifacts. Their purpose is functional. Once that purpose is fulfilled, their value diminishes rapidly. This distinction is critical. Many of the most consequential decisions in the White House begin life as temporary thoughts. A line added to a briefing book, a margin note on a draft speech, a verbal instruction delivered without witnesses. These moments influence policy, but they are not designed to persist. The architecture of executive record-keeping reflects this reality. Presidents receive an overwhelming volume of information: daily briefings, intelligence summaries, policy options, crisis updates. Much of this material is ephemeral by necessity. It must be processed quickly, retained only long enough to inform the next decision. Retention, in this context, is a burden. The White House is not an archive by design. It is a decision engine. Its systems prioritize speed, discretion, and flexibility. Preservation is secondary. This does not mean records are ignored. It means they are filtered. Formal communications are preserved, signed directives, official correspondence, final versions of speeches. These documents form the backbone of the presidential archive. They create the appearance of continuity and deliberation. But beneath them lies a layer that rarely survives intact. Drafts evolve, options are narrowed, alternative approaches are considered and rejected. These processes generate paper trails that are, by definition, provisional. They are not meant to represent final thought. They are meant to facilitate it. Once a decision is made, these materials lose their function. In many cases, they are discarded as a matter of routine. This routine is not hidden. Presidential records laws acknowledge it implicitly. They distinguish between official records and personal or transitory materials. The latter category is broad. It includes notes used for reference, drafts not circulated, documents that do not reflect policy. The definition is flexible. That flexibility grants discretion. Discretion determines survival. Throughout modern history, this distinction has shaped what remains available for later scrutiny. Historians reconstruct presidencies from what survives, not from what existed. The difference is significant. What survives is what the system deemed worth keeping. This process is especially visible during moments of crisis. In crises, documentation becomes a liability. Time is compressed. Decisions are made verbally. Instructions are issued without formal authorization. Records lag behind events. Later, when the crisis passes, the record is reconstructed from memory and selected documentation. Gaps are inevitable. Those gaps are not always accidental. In the White House, memory is managed. This management does not require concealment. It requires prioritization. Certain actions are formalized, others are allowed to dissolve. The result is an archive that appears complete, but is selectively dense. This selectivity becomes evident only when questions arise. When investigators, journalists, or historians attempt to trace the origin of a decision, they often encounter a polished surface. Official records show outcomes. They rarely show hesitation. The absence of hesitation is misleading. Every policy involves uncertainty. Every decision involves alternatives. Those alternatives are often undocumented or discarded early. When they vanish, the record presents inevitability where none existed. This is not an accident of poor record keeping. It is a feature of executive function. The White House must project decisiveness. It must appear controlled. Ambiguity undermines authority. Documentation that reveals uncertainty complicates that projection. Thus, not everything is preserved. This reality has been acknowledged repeatedly in retrospect. Presidential libraries contain gaps. Archivists note missing drafts. Researchers encounter references to documents that no longer exist. These absences are rarely framed as losses. They are framed as normal. Normality is powerful. It absorbs concern. The phrase, "never meant to survive," does not imply intent to destroy. It implies intent not to preserve. That distinction matters. Destruction suggests concealment. Non-preservation suggests design. The White House operates on design. Design that separates what must endure from what must not. This separation becomes more pronounced with the growth of the national security state. Intelligence briefings, covert actions, and classified discussions generate information that is tightly controlled. Documentation exists, but it is fragmented across agencies. The White House receives summaries, not full files. Those summaries are often verbal. Verbal briefings leave no paper trail unless someone chooses to create one. Choice defines the archive. In some administrations, presidents favored detailed notes. In others, they relied on conversation. Styles varied. The archive reflects those styles. The consequence is uneven memory. Some presidencies are richly documented, others are sparse. This disparity shapes historical understanding. Sparse documentation does not indicate inactivity. It indicates a different approach to record keeping. The White House files that were never meant to survive exist in this space. They include draft policy options that were rejected before formal review, notes taken during meetings that were never transcribed, briefing materials designed for single use, internal summaries that were replaced by updated versions, personal annotations that clarified thinking but were never shared. Each of these elements influenced decisions. Few remain accessible. Their disappearance does not erase outcomes, it erases process. Process is where accountability lives. Without process, history becomes declarative. It records what happened, not how or why. This limitation becomes apparent during investigations. When scandals emerge, investigators attempt to reconstruct sequences of events. They search for timelines. They examine correspondence. They look for documentation that connects decision to action. Often, they find gaps. Those gaps are not always the result of wrongdoing. They are the result of selective survival. The White House files that were never meant to survive were never integrated into formal record-keeping systems. They existed briefly, served a purpose, and were allowed to fade. Allowed, not forced. This allowance is central to understanding executive power. Power preserves what legitimizes it. It does not always preserve what complicates it. This is not cynicism, it is structure. Structures optimize for function. In the White House, function means decision-making. Decision-making requires flexibility. Flexibility resists permanence. Permanence invites scrutiny. Scrutiny slows action. Thus, the system balances visibility and opacity continuously. What emerges is not secrecy in the dramatic sense, but selectivity in the mundane one. The files that were never meant to survive are not hidden in vaults, they are absent from shelves. Their absence is quiet, it does not announce itself. It is discovered only when someone looks for something that should exist and does not. This discovery often occurs years later. By then, explanations are procedural, records retention policies, transitory classification, administrative discretion. Each explanation is reasonable. Together, they create a pattern in which the most revealing traces of power rarely endure. This chapter is not about a single missing document. It is about an environment. An environment in which the White House produces far more information than it preserves. An environment where memory is curated through practice rather than decree. An environment where disappearance is not an event, but an expectation. The White House files that were never meant to survive were not failures of transparency. They were the byproduct of governance. To understand what follows, it is necessary to accept this premise. That history is shaped as much by what is discarded as by what is retained. That the archive is not a neutral mirror, it is a construction. And every construction begins with choices. The next chapter moves inside those choices, into the spaces, routines, and mechanisms that determine which moments become records and which dissolve before history ever has a chance to see them. If documents decide what survives, space decides what is created. Inside the White House, space is never neutral. Every room carries an implicit rule about what can be said, what will be written down, and what will leave a trace. Some rooms are built for record-keeping. Others are built to avoid it. This distinction is rarely formalized, but it is widely understood. The White House is not a single office. It is a network of shifting environments, ceremonial rooms, permanent offices, temporary workspaces, crisis centers, private studies, corridors, and rooms that exist only for a particular moment in time. Each produces a different kind of memory. Official meeting rooms generate minutes. Briefing rooms generate summaries. Press rooms generate transcripts. But many of the most consequential conversations do not happen in any of those spaces. They happen in places designed for speed, discretion, and containment. Temporary offices are one example. During transitions, emergencies, or reorganizations, staff are relocated quickly. Desks appear where there were none before. Phones are installed temporarily. Files are kept close, often physically, rather than within formal systems. These spaces are not meant to last, neither are the materials created within them. Crisis rooms function differently still. In moments of urgency, the White House prioritizes immediacy over documentation. Information flows verbally. Updates are continuous. Decisions are revised minute by minute. Writing things down becomes secondary. In such environments, documentation lags behind action. Notes are taken for reference, not preservation. Whiteboards are erased, briefing slides are updated and overwritten. What remains afterward is a reconstruction, not a record. Reconstruction favors coherence. It smooths contradictions. It compresses time. It removes hesitation. The architecture of the White House reinforces this process. Certain rooms are physically isolated, soundproofed, secure. Entry is restricted. No staff are assigned to record proceedings unless explicitly instructed. In these rooms, the absence of documentation is not a failure, it is a feature. Meetings described as informal often take place here. Informal does not mean unimportant, it means unrecorded. Informality allows flexibility, it allows deniability, it allows decisions to be explored without commitment. Once explored, those decisions may later be formalized elsewhere, stripped of context. What disappears is not the outcome, it is the deliberation. Another category of space plays a similar role: personal offices. Presidents and senior advisors operate within highly individualized environments. Their habits shape documentation. Some dictate notes, others rely on memory. Some keep extensive personal files, others keep almost nothing. These habits have historical consequences. When personal offices are cleared at the end of an administration, materials are sorted rapidly. What is deemed official is transferred. What is deemed personal is handled separately. What falls in between is vulnerable. The boundary between personal and official is not always clear. A handwritten note can be either. A marked-up briefing can be either. A private memo can influence public policy. Classification does not resolve this ambiguity. Intent does. What the author believes the document represents determines its fate. Documents believed to be temporary are treated as such. They are not archived. They are reused, overwritten, or discarded. This practice is not hidden, it is normalized. Within the White House, there is an understanding that not every action should generate a permanent trace. Permanence slows governance. It invites reinterpretation. It creates exposure long after context has vanished. Space enforces this understanding. Corridors are one example. Important conversations happen while walking, between meetings, away from desks, without witnesses. These conversations are efficient. They are also invisible. Nothing records them unless someone chooses to remember them later. Memory is selective. Selectivity favors outcomes. Another example is the use of secure communication spaces. Conversations conducted on secure lines or in shielded rooms may be logged technically, but not transcribed. Logs show that communication occurred, not what was said. Content disappears by design. Even when notes are taken in these environments, they are rarely formal. They are reminders, fragments, key words. Once the immediate purpose is served, the notes lose meaning. Meaningless notes are discarded. This is not accidental loss. It is functional loss. The White House depends on functional loss to operate. Without it, the volume of information would become unmanageable. Every conversation would become potential evidence. Every hesitation would become a liability. Thus, space becomes a filter. Some spaces produce records automatically. Others actively resist them. This resistance is subtle. No sign reads, "Nothing said here will be recorded." No policy mandates silence. Instead, norms guide behavior. Staff know when to speak carefully. They know when to avoid email. They know when to leave no trace. These norms are learned quickly. They are reinforced by proximity to power. The closer a space is to decision-making, the less likely it is to produce durable documentation. This creates a paradox. The most important decisions are often the least documented. Not because they are secret, because they are fragile. Fragility requires protection. Protection is achieved through ephemerality. This ephemerality becomes visible only later, when someone attempts to reconstruct events. Investigators search for meeting notes. Archivists look for drafts. Historians look for correspondence. They find outcomes. They rarely find process. The absence is spatial. It originates in rooms where documentation was neither expected nor encouraged. Over time, these absences accumulate. They form patterns. Patterns reveal design. The White House does not erase its memory dramatically. It allows it to dissipate through movement, speed, and informality. Space makes this possible. The second chapter is not about missing files. It is about missing rooms. Rooms that shape decisions without shaping archives. Rooms that hosted conversations without producing transcripts. Rooms that existed briefly and left nothing behind. Understanding these spaces explains why so many files were never meant to survive. They were born in environments that were never meant to remember. The next chapter turns from space to classification, from where information is created to how it is labelled, sorted, and quietly allowed to disappear under the language of temporary, working, and non-record. Because disappearance does not begin at destruction, it begins at definition. Disappearance does not begin with loss. It begins with definition. Inside the White House, the fate of information is often decided at the moment it is named. Not all files are equal. Not all documents are considered records. The distinction is legal, procedural, and deeply consequential. A record is something the system agrees to remember. Everything else is temporary. The language used to describe documents determines their lifespan. Terms like working paper, draft, background material, or informal note carry specific implications. They suggest utility without obligation, purpose without permanence. Once a document is classified as temporary, it enters a different life cycle. It is not catalogued with the same rigor. It is not indexed for future retrieval. It is not preserved for historical review. It is allowed to expire. This expiration is not dramatic. It does not require authorization. It does not leave a trace. It is administrative. In the White House, this process is routine. Policy discussions generate volumes of material that never reach final form. Options papers outline multiple paths. Briefing memos are revised repeatedly. Talking points are adjusted to suit evolving circumstances. Each iteration produces text. Most iterations are not preserved. They are overwritten. Overwriting is efficient. It keeps systems lean. It reduces clutter. It ensures that only the most current version remains visible. But overwriting also erases process. The evolution of thought disappears. The narrowing of choices vanishes. What remains is the final position, detached from its origins. This detachment is not accidental. Final positions are easier to defend when they appear inevitable. The White House relies heavily on this mechanism. During periods of intense decision-making, especially in national security contexts, documentation accelerates and evaporates simultaneously. Briefings are updated hourly. Slides are modified between meetings. Data is refreshed continuously. The system prioritizes relevance over retention. Once relevance passes, retention ends. This is reinforced by legal frameworks. Presidential records laws establish broad categories of preservation, but they also grant wide discretion. Materials deemed purely advisory, personal, or transitory may be excluded. The determination often rests with those creating the documents. Creators are not neutral archivists, they are participants. Participants have incentives. They are focused on clarity, persuasion, and outcome. They are not focused on how their drafts will be interpreted decades later. Thus, documents that expose uncertainty are less likely to survive. Uncertainty complicates narratives. Narratives stabilize authority. This dynamic becomes especially pronounced during controversial decisions. When policy choices carry political or moral risk, internal debate intensifies. Drafts multiply. Language is tested and abandoned. Arguments are refined and softened. The paper trail is rich in the moment. It is thin in retrospect. Later, when questions arise about how a decision was made, the archive often presents a streamlined version. It shows consensus where there was debate, resolution where there was hesitation. This is not fabrication, it is filtration. The filtration occurs through categorization. Documents that reach a certain threshold of formality are preserved. Those that do not are excluded by definition. Definition is powerful. It allows disappearance to occur without intent. The White House also employs classification as a secondary filter. Classification determines who can access information and for how long. Highly classified materials are handled within restricted systems. Their storage, duplication, and dissemination are tightly controlled. These controls create fragility. When classified systems change, records must be migrated. Migration introduces risk. Formats become obsolete. Indexing schemes change. Files are reorganized. Each reorganization creates opportunities for loss. Loss is rarely acknowledged. It is masked by complexity. A document that cannot be located within a classified system may still exist somewhere, but without a clear path to retrieval, existence becomes irrelevant. Irrelevance is a form of disappearance. The classification system also encourages minimal documentation. The more sensitive the information, the greater the incentive to limit written records. Conversations replace memos. Briefings replace reports. Oral instructions replace directives. Oral instructions leave no archive. They leave memory. Memory fades. This practice is not hidden, it is taught. Senior staff learn quickly when to avoid creating documents. They understand which topics should remain verbal. They know which discussions should not be summarized. This knowledge is not written down, it is transmitted culturally. Culture governs preservation more effectively than policy. The result is an archive shaped not by completeness, but by comfort. What the system is comfortable preserving survives. What it is uncomfortable preserving dissolves. Comfort is influenced by risk. Documents that could be misinterpreted later are risky. Drafts reveal indecision. Notes capture emotion. Marginalia exposes thought processes. These elements humanize decision-making. They also weaken institutional narratives. Thus, they are less likely to endure. Over time, this practice produces a familiar pattern. The closer a document is to raw deliberation, the less likely it is to survive. The closer it is to polished outcome, the more secure its place in the archive. This pattern has consequences. When historians study presidencies, they encounter a disproportionate number of final statements. They see what was decided. They rarely see how decisions were contested. The absence is structural. It is built into how files are defined. The phrase "never meant to survive" captures this design precisely. Survival is not the default state of White House documents. Survival is earned through classification, formality, and perceived legitimacy. Everything else is expendable. This expendability extends to digital records. Email systems, messaging platforms, and digital briefing tools generate vast quantities of information. Retention policies exist, but enforcement varies. Messages are deleted routinely. Drafts are overwritten automatically. Temporary files expire by design. Digital efficiency accelerates disappearance. What once required physical destruction now requires only inaction. If a file is not archived deliberately, it vanishes on its own. The White House has adapted to this reality. Systems are configured to retain what is necessary and discard the rest. Necessity is defined narrowly. As a result, the digital archive mirrors the paper one. Outcomes are preserved, process is thinned. When controversies emerge, investigators often discover that crucial exchanges occurred through channels that left no trace. Decisions were coordinated verbally, guidance was informal, documentation lagged behind action. Reconstruction becomes speculative. Speculation lacks authority. Authority resides in documents. Without documents, narratives harden quickly. The absence of records does not prevent accountability entirely, but it limits its scope. Accountability focuses on what can be proven, not on what can be inferred. Inference is weaker. Thus, disappearance shapes consequence. The third chapter reveals that the White House files that were never meant to survive were not anomalies. They were products of a system that defines memory narrowly and efficiently. Definition determines fate. Once a file is defined as temporary, its disappearance is expected. No explanation is required, no alarm is triggered. The archive absorbs the loss silently. This silence is not suspicious, it is normal. And normality is the most effective camouflage. The next chapter examines what happens when this normality collides with crisis, when temporary files suddenly become essential, and the system discovers that what it chose not to remember is exactly what history demands. Because sometimes the moment that reveals truth arrives long after the moment that erased it. The moment temporary information becomes essential is always delayed. In the White House, this delay is structural. Decisions are made first. Consequences arrive later, and when they do, the system often discovers that what it now needs was never designed to remain. Crises expose this gap. Scandals, investigations, and historical reassessments do not ask what was intended to be preserved. They ask what actually existed at the moment decisions were made. When that material is missing, absence becomes visible. This is where the White House archive reveals its limits. During periods of calm, the distinction between permanent and temporary documentation appears functional. Drafts disappear, but outcomes remain. Notes are discarded, but policy is recorded. Nothing seems lost. But when a crisis reframes the past, the value of documentation shifts. What was once considered irrelevant suddenly becomes central. Investigators begin searching for origins. Who suggested the policy? Who opposed it? What alternatives were discussed? What warnings were raised? These questions cannot be answered by final documents alone. They require process. Process lives in drafts, notes, emails, margin comments, and informal briefings. It lives in the material that was never meant to survive. When that material is gone, reconstruction becomes speculative. Speculation is not evidence. This realization has occurred repeatedly in the modern White House. During investigations into executive misconduct, congressional committees often request internal communications predating formal decisions. They ask for early drafts, preliminary analyses, internal dissent. What they receive is uneven. Sometimes fragments remain, sometimes nothing does. The explanation is always procedural. Documents were working papers, drafts were overwritten, notes were personal, briefings were verbal. Each explanation is valid. Together, they form a wall. This wall does not block inquiry entirely, but it channels it. Investigations focus on what can be proven. They avoid what cannot. The absence of records does not imply innocence. It does not imply guilt. It implies limitation. This limitation shapes outcomes. When investigators cannot establish intent through documentation, they rely on testimony. Testimony is fragile. Memories diverge. Recollections conflict. Time erodes certainty. Documents stabilize memory. Without them, truth becomes negotiable. The White House understands this dynamic intuitively. It does not need to destroy files to manage exposure. It needs only to ensure that certain categories of material remain temporary. When a crisis arrives, those materials are already gone. Gone without intent, gone by design. This design becomes most apparent during transitions. At the end of an administration, records are transferred rapidly, staff depart, offices are cleared. Digital systems are archived or decommissioned. Decisions about what constitutes an official record are made under pressure. Time is limited, ambiguity is costly. In these moments, discretion expands. Materials that clearly qualify as records are preserved. Materials that do not are discarded or excluded. This sorting process is not forensic. It is practical. Practicality favors clarity. Clarity favors outcomes. The result is an archive that reflects decisions, not deliberations. Later, when controversies resurface or new information comes to light, investigators confront this absence directly. They ask why certain communications are missing, why timelines cannot be fully reconstructed, why key moments appear undocumented. The answers rarely satisfy. Not because they are false, because they are systemic. The system was not built to preserve uncertainty. It was built to resolve it. Once resolution occurs, uncertainty loses value. This is the paradox of executive record keeping. The moments most valuable to history are often the least valuable to governance in real time. They slow action, they complicate messaging, they expose hesitation, thus they are filtered out early. The White House does not operate with historical curiosity in mind. It operates with political urgency. Urgency compresses time. Compressed time discourages documentation. Documentation invites reflection. Reflection delays action. This chain explains why so many crucial decisions leave behind so little trace of how they were made. When crisis later demands answers, the system can offer only what it retained, and what it retained was never meant to tell the full story. This becomes especially visible in matters of national security. Security decisions often involve classified channels, oral briefings, and compartmentalized discussions. Documentation exists, but it is fragmented across agencies. The White House receives conclusions, not raw material. Those conclusions are recorded. The debates that produce them are not. When investigations later attempt to assess accountability, they encounter a distributed archive. Pieces exist in different systems, governed by different rules. Some pieces cannot be accessed at all. Reconstruction becomes partial. Partial reconstruction encourages closure rather than inquiry. At some point, investigators must decide whether absence itself constitutes a finding. Usually it does not. Absence is treated as limitation, not evidence. This treatment protects institutions. It also limits truth. The fourth chapter is where the cost of non-survival becomes clear. Files that were never meant to survive now appear essential. Their absence shapes conclusions. It narrows responsibility. It constrains interpretation. The White House does not need to intervene at this stage. The work was done earlier. By defining what was temporary, by allowing drafts to dissolve, by favoring verbal exchange over written trace, by treating deliberation as expendable. This approach is not illegal, it is not covert, it is cultural. Culture persists even when personnel change. Thus, each administration inherits not just an office, but a memory practice, a practice that values decisiveness over documentation. When crises arrive, that practice determines what can be known. Investigations often conclude with phrases like insufficient evidence or unable to determine intent. These conclusions reflect not a failure of inquiry, but a failure of preservation. Preservation was never the priority. This is the quiet power of ephemerality. It shields not through secrecy, but through absence. The White House files that were never meant to survive reveal their importance only when it is too late to recover them. By then, the system has moved on, the archive is fixed, and history must work with what remains. The final chapter turns to what this means for transparency itself. For the idea that the White House can ever be fully known through records, and for the uncomfortable truth that some parts of power are designed to disappear before anyone knows to look for them. Transparency is often described as a destination. In reality, it is a boundary. The White House does not resist transparency outright. It manages it. It defines how far inquiry can go before it reaches the edge of what the institution is designed to remember. Beyond that edge, the record thins, not because something is hidden, but because it was never meant to exist in durable form. This is the final condition of disappearance, not secrecy, not destruction. Design. The files that were never meant to survive were not mistakes in an otherwise complete system. They were part of how the system functions. They allowed decisions to be made quickly, quietly, and without permanent exposure to future interpretation. That exposure is not abstract. Documents do not simply record events, they reinterpret them. Every draft preserved invites re-examination. Every margin note preserved invites speculation. Every early option preserved invites judgment. For a system that must act under pressure, this is risk. Risk is managed by selectivity. What survives is what can be defended. What disappears is what complicates defense. This does not require coordination, it requires habit. Habit shapes behavior more reliably than rules. Over time, administrations learn what produces lasting records and what does not. They adapt accordingly. Sensitive discussions move to informal spaces. Early thinking remains verbal. Drafts are overwritten, notes are discarded, nothing dramatic occurs. The archive simply narrows. Later, when historians or investigators look back, they encounter a polished surface. Executive orders, public statements, formal memoranda, the visible structure of governance. What they do not see is the scaffolding. The scaffolding is temporary by nature. Once the structure stands, it is removed. The White House files that were never meant to survive were scaffolding. They supported decision-making, but were never intended to define it. This distinction explains why so many efforts to fully reconstruct executive history reach a limit. That limit is not imposed later, it is built in at the beginning. Presidential records laws, archival practices, and classification systems all reinforce this boundary. They preserve outcomes, not deliberations. They record authority, not uncertainty. Uncertainty is transient. History prefers certainty. Thus, the archive aligns with history's preferences. The cost of this alignment is subtle. It does not erase wrongdoing. It does not fabricate innocence. It reduces texture. Without texture, accountability becomes binary. Decisions are either justified or unjustified. Actions are either authorized or unauthorized. The grey space where power actually operates disappears. That grey space is where intent forms. Without access to intent, judgment becomes limited. This limitation is often mistaken for closure. Investigations conclude, reports are issued, lessons are articulated, oversight structures are reinforced. The system moves forward. What is left behind is an archive that appears sufficient. Sufficiency is convincing. It discourages further inquiry. The White House benefits from this dynamic without needing to exploit it. The system is optimized to produce it. Every administration inherits the same constraints. Every president operates within the same architectural logic. Transparency is expanded when politically necessary. Opacity returns when urgency demands it. Neither state is permanent. The balance shifts constantly. What does not shift is the underlying rule. Only certain kinds of information are meant to last. This rule defines the boundary of historical knowledge. It ensures that some questions can never be answered definitively, not because answers are forbidden, because evidence is absent. Absence is not scandalous, it is normal. This normality is what makes it powerful. If disappearance were rare, it would provoke response. Because it is routine, it is accepted. Accepted absence becomes invisible. The White House files that were never meant to survive are invisible in this way. They are not hidden in vaults. They are not protected by extraordinary secrecy. They are simply not there. Their absence shapes what can be known. When new controversies arise, when power is questioned again, investigators return to the archive, hoping to learn from the past. They find guidance, they find precedent, they find boundaries. They do not find the raw material of decision-making. That material belonged to a moment. Once the moment passed, it dissolved. This is not a failure of democracy, it is a feature of executive governance. Democracy demands accountability. Governance demands efficiency. Efficiency resists permanence. The tension between these demands defines the modern presidency. The White House files that were never meant to survive sit at the center of that tension. They remind us that transparency is always partial, that archives are constructed, not discovered, that what we know about power is shaped as much by what is forgotten as by what is preserved. The record is not neutral. It is curated by necessity. The final lesson of this archive is not cynical, it is structural. The White House cannot be fully known through documents alone. Some parts of governance exist only in action, memory, and consequence. When those moments pass, they leave impressions, not records. History must work with impressions. And impressions harden quickly. Once hardened, they become accepted truth. The files that never survived cannot challenge that truth. They cannot complicate it. They cannot return. Their disappearance is complete not because someone decided it should be, but because the system moved on. And once the system moves on, memory follows. What remains is an archive that speaks clearly about outcomes and quietly about process. An archive that offers answers while withholding questions. An archive that invites confidence but not curiosity. This is the limit of transparency. Not the point where secrecy begins, but the point where documentation ends. Beyond that point, power continues to operate. History continues to be written. But the files that could have told us how decisions were truly made are already gone. Not lost, not destroyed, simply never meant to survive. Power does not need to erase its past to control it. Sometimes it only needs to decide what is worth remembering. The White House preserves outcomes. It does not preserve every process. Black Archive explores the boundary where transparency ends and disappearance becomes routine. More files were never created to survive, and some histories were shaped by their absence. The archive is complete enough. The questions are not.